Who am I? Duh. What makes me me? How can I know who I am? These are some of the most important and fundamental questions that we ask ourselves in life. Now, having some sort of a background or affiliation with the LDS faith, we have some simple answers. We're children of God. We are immortal spirits in mortal bodies. We are siblings to Christ and each other. Great, good, awesome. We have answers. Yay! But what about those things that make us different? What about when we look around a room and we realize we're not the same as everyone else? What about personality, sexuality, gender identity? How can we know about these unique aspects of ourselves? And not suspect what they are, but know with a capital K who we are. How can we understand self? Almost all of us in this room know why we're here. We are trying to reconcile some sort of a conflict that we feel inside of ourselves. Sometimes we feel like we need to abandon a critical part of who we are to be happy. We feel caught in the middle. We feel like walking contradictions, right? Wrong. I'm going to state a truth, and I want you to internalize it as much as you can. You are not a contradiction. What I want to share with you today is a formula to help us reconcile the parts of us that feel like contradictions. We're going to explore the concept of self and learn how to know who we really are, leading happy, peaceful lives, completely congruent in our knowledge of ourself and our relationship with God. Cool, let's start with the basics. So there's an essential human template for all of us. Today we'll define it by calling it the primary self. The primary self is going to look the same for all of us, no matter who we are, where we're from, or what we do. This primary self has 5 principal points. Divinity exists. We can have a relationship or open dialogue with divinity. We ourselves are divine and eternal in nature. We are innately good and naturally seek happiness, and we are innately creative. So looking at this model of the primary self, we can see that it hinges on communication with God. This might seem like an offensive idea to some of us because of negative experiences within the LDS Church, but it's an idea that stands up outside of Mormonism. Throughout history, there are accounts of people interacting with the divine. It almost always comes down to feelings of peace, warmth in the bosom, knowledge suddenly impressed on the mind, or feelings suddenly given beyond our current scope of reference. This communication can happen in the form of prayer, meditation, pondering, or simply drawing out your thoughts toward God. Now, it's critical that in this communication, we assume that we are good people and we're trying our best to be happy. With that assumption, we can receive communication as we ask questions. That communication will happen in a similar pattern to what I mentioned before. Warmth in the bosom, feelings of peace, ideas, thoughts, impressions. This relationship with God and the communication with God become the building blocks of the concept of self, the primary self. The second aspect of self is the individual self. Now, the individual self is where we find all the unique stuff. It's made up of parts of us that don't change. They simply are. They are personality, sexuality, and gender identity. Now, modern psychology shows with increasing certainty that these aspects of us don't change. That doesn't mean that we can't develop a deeper understanding of them, but the very nature of them doesn't change. So then I propose the question, how do we really know what our personality, sexuality, and gender identity are? Some of it may seem very obvious. Other parts a little bit more difficult to define. These are the most nuanced and complex parts of us. So I'm actually going to leave you with that cliffhanger question. Let it percolate in the back of your mind for a minute, and we'll go ahead and cover the last aspect of self because it'll help us answer that question. The final aspect of self is the outer self. Now, this is made up of all the parts of us that change, our opinions, our viewpoints, everything that stems from our interaction with the outside world. This part should constantly evolve and change. It's where we find progress, difference, learning. Our interaction with church, family, friends, school, all parts of the outer self. So with these three parts of self defined, primary self, individual self, and outer self, we find that it's the individual self that gives us trouble. When personality, sexuality, or gender identity go undefined, we begin to lose all sense of self. But our understanding of the individual self hinges critically on the use of either the primary self or the outer self. So let's look at what happens when we define the individual self through the outer self with an example. This is not a real person, disclaimer, just in case your name is Ben. Ben is a 23-year-old gay man. His feelings lead him to know he's gay, but he's not exactly sure what that means. So he surrounds himself with other gay men. He begins to define his sexuality on his social interactions. So it's his social group that holds the power to define his sexuality. Well, that definition is going to change with the popular ideas and thoughts of this social group. And Ben's sexuality will need to change correspondingly, or he won't feel that it's valid. He feels the need to meet that expectation. And if he's separated from this social group, he begins to feel lost and alone. Unfortunately, this also creates an atmosphere where Ben really can't successfully interact with people that disagree with that specific idea of his sexuality. Ben has given up the ability to define his sexuality to those outside of himself. Now let's look at another example. Someone that uses the primary self to help define their individual self. Patricia is a biological woman in her early 40s. She's always questioned her gender identity. Now, Patricia is also devoutly religious. Through prayer, she learns that her lonely unhappiness stems from a denial of who she really is. She asks God specifically if she's right about these feelings concerning her gender identity, and receives confirmation through a series of spiritual experiences. This gives Patricia the confidence to meet with a doctor, begin hormone therapy, meet with support groups, find other people in similar situations. Patricia also continues to attend church, even though people don't understand and gossip. Not out of a feeling of guilt or responsibility or expectation, out of a desire to feed her spirituality. Despite anything that anybody else does, Patricia retains the ability to define herself because she knows what her individual self is. She knows what her primary self is. She walks the path that makes her happy, the path that God has defined as hers. The difference is obvious. When we define the individual self through the outer self, we give up the ability to say who we are and leave that to the opinions and viewpoints of other people. But here's the great unfortunate truth in this. It is absolutely impossible to live up to the expectations of everybody else concerning who you should be and how you should live your life. However, if you define and validate your individual self through the primary self, you retain the ability to say who you are, and God confirms that to you. Now here's the coolest part. When you know yourself, with a capital K, you can manipulate the circumstances of your life to play to your strengths, resulting in fulfillment and happiness. When you know yourself with that capital K, when you know what your personality, gender identity, and sexuality are confirmed to you by God and you define that, you can consistently make choices that result in your happiness and fulfillment. You can create a world that plays to your strengths, that offers you success in every aspect of life. Now, all of this is oversimplified. It's bright and shiny and happy and Disney, but the process of getting to know ourselves, know with a capital K, is gritty and dirty and difficult, but it's just that, it's a process. However, the formula will always be the same. Have you talked to God? Go home and do it. Invest in the process of getting to know yourself as good as you can. And when you know more about yourself, trust in your ability to create a space in this world that is every bit as unique as you are. The feelings of being a contradiction will melt away. You'll increase in confidence. You enable yourself to make choices and progress instead of sitting still in the ocean of life without wind in your sails. You'll be able to peacefully, calmly, and with the confidence of confirmation from God, be you.